Good evening. My name is Mary Egan, and I'm the president of the library board here in Spring Lake. And I want to welcome all of you. So many of you have been with us through this lecture series, but if you have not, welcome. We're thrilled to. This is the fourth and final of the lecture, the Hamilton Lecture Series held here. Those of you who were with us last week know that the series somewhat is going to be extended. There is going to be another lecture that kind of goes along with this lecture series held in Grand Rapids in September. The flyers are right here up on the table, and I'll be standing at the end of the lecture and we can pass them out, kind of a brown bag lunch to be held in Grand Rapids. But Hank Meyer has agreed to speak on, to follow up with our Hamilton series, so we're thrilled by that. So, welcome all of you to the final lecture to go along with the wonderful exhibit we have out in the library, Alexander Hamilton, the Man Who Made Modern America. The lecture series will end after tonight, but the exhibit will remain until August 18th. So we have a few more weeks of it here. So please make sure you tell people in town who may not have had an opportunity to see the exhibit to make sure they get over here in the nice air-conditioned facility. Aren't we grateful tonight? Make sure that people come and see that before we have to pack it up and ship it on. We are so grateful as we end this lecture series to the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies at Grand Valley State University. As their staff were really the ones that organized this Hamilton Lecture Series and is sponsoring the lectures to complement our exhibit. I've been with them for the last hour or so having dinner and said, what a great partnership we've developed, and we hope that it will continue. We have ideas for next summer already. So, the Hauenstein Center at Grand Valley was founded in 2001 to advance discussion of the U.S. presidency among scholars, government leaders, students, and the public, and to inspire a new generation of leaders devoted to public service. This center has been made possible through the generosity of philanthropist Ralph Hauenstein, who is with us this evening. He joined us. Ralph, would you just stand and let us welcome you to Spring Lake? I think Ralph could just do the follow-up to the lecture series. He's just an amazing person to sit and listen to. It's just been a thrill to be with him. So it's such an honor to have him here tonight. But normally at this point, if you've been to the lectures before, I turn it over to someone else to introduce the lecturer. But tonight I get to do that honor because it is our honor to have as our lecturer tonight the director of the Hauenstein Center, Gleaves Whitney, who usually does the introduction, so I get to introduce him to you formally. Gleaves did his graduate work in history at the University of Michigan. He became the director of the Hauenstein Center at Grand Valley in 2003. Prior to his present position, he served as the chief historian for Michigan Governor John Engler. In 1993, he served on the governor's task force on education, whose work led to the enactment of some far-reaching reforms in our state. In addition, Gleaves has written or edited 11 books. His most recent is American Presidents, Farewell Addresses to the Nation, and he's currently working on a collection of wartime speeches of American presidents. So he's been here just in a small ways all through the lecture series, and it is an honor to have him as our lecturer this evening. I'm going to turn it over to Gleaves.
Well, thank you very much, Mary, for a very warm introduction. I really appreciate that, and it's been such a treat to be part of this lecture series and for us to have the opportunity to lecture with Spring Lake, with your fine staff, Mary and Claire and Lisa, and I see there's Claire back there. But what a first-rate group of people with whom to have a partnership. I'm going to go even one step further. We are definitely going to have a partnership. We are definitely going to do something here next summer as well. We're going to keep a good thing going. Well, I've got to say the pressure is really on me tonight. I see a lot of familiar faces here, and if you've been here the last 3 weeks, you know the quality of the speakers we've had. We had a wonderful speaker open up when we had Jason Duncan come in 3 weeks ago. I've got to point out, before I review very briefly who we've had speak, isn't it interesting that we had that first talk on the eve of the duel between Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr. And here we're having the closing speech when it's Coast Guard Week, which of course is an Alexander Hamilton initiative. So we have this wonderful bookends. I wish I could take credit. I'm sure, Mary, you wish you could take credit for our having some kind of design to do this, but it just worked out to be serendipitous. But that first talk by Jason Duncan of Aquinas College was absolutely stellar, went through the life of Hamilton, and you saw that Hamilton had one of the most extraordinary lives of any of the founders. I mean, here's a guy who was born illegitimate, hardly knew a father. His mother dies of a tropical fever when he's 12 years old. As an orphan then, he's working in these, as a clerk in a Caribbean island, and he proves himself to be so brilliant that the owner of the business for whom he works sends him off to New York. And so here's this, he's the founder who is not born in America. He's the founder who develops this view of the United States as a unit that the others who are, say, from Virginia or from Massachusetts or from New York don't have, because they have particular attachments to those places. Alexander Hamilton has something else going on. It makes him different. It makes him unique. But something else that makes him different, makes him unique, is this incredible intellectual capacity, sheer brain power. It was already evident when he was about 12, 14 years old. As I say, as a clerk, and of course Jason went through all of this. As a clerk, he is sent off to New York to get a proper education because the island of Nevis and the island of St. Croix there in the Caribbean cannot offer the first-class education that a boy of this talent deserved. So he goes to King's College, which becomes Columbia University, and proves himself brilliant there. But I want you to think about the fact that just 3 years before the Revolution, he's an illegitimate orphan working in a merchant's shop. And this is the man who is going to, in turn now, come to these shores, help lead the revolution, lead the army, help lead the army that will be victorious in the revolution, write the papers that help us define what the Constitution is and what it means to us, and go on and have a brilliant career, and then have the most spectacular death of all of the founders, killed by the Vice President of the United States. And you think politics gets messy today? I mean, this guy's story proves that truth is stranger than fiction. And I think Jason did a great job that first week. Then the second week, we had John Pinero, also an historian at Aquinas College, come in and talk to us about the great intellectual divide, one of the greatest divides in American thought and culture. And that's the Hamiltonians versus the Jeffersonians, two entirely different visions that we're going to talk about a little bit more this evening. But the Hamiltonian vision of a commercial republic versus the Jeffersonian vision of an agrarian republic of yeoman farmers. Jefferson's inspiration going back to these mythic Saxon kings, Henge and Horsa. No one can establish that they actually lived, but it truly was mythological, shrouded in mists. Hamilton's grounding and the knowledge of the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire and the history of republics that had well-documented histories. And so we heard about that incredible divide that has divided our country ever since between the Hamiltonians and Jeffersonians. And then we had last week Jim Bratt come in from Calvin College. He also gave a wonderful talk. Jim's talk had to do with the religious climate of the day and how Alexander Hamilton is neither fish nor fowl. It's hard to place where he is exactly in the Christian or deist spectrum. There are signs that early in his life and at the end of his life he was a confessing Christian, but all through the middle of his career, through most of the time he had impact on the nation's founding, he does not appear to have been explicitly Christian, more in the deist mold, but with a Calvinist worldview. And so we learned from Jim about the importance of the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening and those currents in 18th century thought that were reflected in Hamilton's life and mind. Well, in the course of the talks, we've been exposed to some awfully extreme views of Alexander Hamilton, ranging from the scurrilously negative to the flatteringly positive. In Hamilton's struggle to put forth his vision of what this country should be, he made a lot of political enemies. And so you had, among his most vocal critics, John Adams, who referred to Hamilton as the foreigner. He never could live that down, the foreigner, and called him, quote, the most restless, impatient, artful, indefatigable, and unprincipled intriguer in the United States, if not the world. That's what John Adams said. Now, John Adams was never one to fall into the error of understatement, is that just point out. So he's even more complimentary, more direct, when he called Hamilton, and this is the famous quotation that all of you have heard, the bastard son of a Scottish peddler. Well, Hamilton also had the worst kind of enemy, literally the mortal enemy. We use that term, mortal enemy. Well, he literally had his mortal enemy in Aaron Burr, who, of course, on July 11th shot Hamilton in a duel. And Hamilton lingered for 31 hours after being shot in agonizing death throes. Agonizing. I mean, death was truly merciful at that point on July 12th. On a positive note, we think of Alexander Hamilton as a war hero at the Battle of Yorktown, for example, as the principal author of the Federalist Papers, and as the trusted aide to George Washington for 2 decades. Now, he was an aide first to Washington during the Revolutionary War for Independence. He was precocious. He was only 20 years old when he was promoted to colonel on Washington's staff. And Washington cottoned to him right away, trusted him right away. Then during, well, I should say before I move on to the second phase of his service to Washington, that Washington trusted him, but they had a very tempestuous relationship. Have you heard about the falling out they had toward the end of the Revolutionary War? When, Hamilton was frustrated again and again because he wanted to go into action, and Washington wanted him close to him there at General Headquarters. So Hamilton, he's a young man, he said, "Send me into battle." And Washington keeps saying, "No, you're not going into battle." So one day, Washington asks Hamilton to deliver a letter and to come back right away, within a minute. And so Hamilton runs up the stairs, gets the letter, goes out, delivers it, and he's delayed by a fellow officer. And so he does not come right back. About 10 minutes later, he gets back. Now, Washington had a terrible temper. You probably know this. He was very irascible at times. Washington standing up there at the top of the stairs and saying, "Sir, you made me wait on you. That's inexcusable." And Hamilton took great umbrage at this, and he dashed off a letter of resignation real quickly, gave it to Washington. Washington, realizing that he had spoken too soon, too harshly to Hamilton, tried to patch up an hour later and say, "No, go ahead and stay. I don't want you to resign." Hamilton, kind of in a bit of a pout at that point, said, "No, sir, I have been insulted and I'm going to go my way." And so Washington and Hamilton have this tumultuous relationship, a very colorful relationship for us. This stuff could be on daytime TV, some of it. Well, then they do make up, and Hamilton comes back to serve as Washington's trusted Secretary of the Treasury. And what a distinguished career he has there. And we will talk about that more because that was his official title as Secretary of Treasury. He served the Washington administration, but unofficially, he was to rival Jefferson over at the State Department in his knowledge of foreign affairs. And get this, Hamilton served briefly as the de facto Secretary of War, and we'll get into that too. So Hamilton was all over the place. Now, my title, by the way, is a play on the title sometimes used for George Washington. It's called the Indespensible Aide. Well, I'm playing on the fact that Washington is sometimes called the indispensable man to the founding of America. Now, Hamilton, as we know, was Washington's indispensable aide for that 2 decades. And this evening, I'd like to talk not so much about how Hamilton was Washington's aide as he was our aide. He is our aide. Because it is through Washington, it's through Hamilton that you understand what this country is really about. This exhibit over here in the next room talks about the making of modern America. No founder is more instrumental to the making of modern America than Alexander Hamilton. That is the key point to remember. And if you look at all the ways in which he was prescient, I mean, he saw the future, he's very prophetic, all the ways in which he had read from the leading thinkers of his day and seemed to be able to pick and discriminate just what it was that this country would grab onto and become. It was a remarkable sense of his. It was the genius of Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton left behind ideas and institutions that have lasted literally for centuries. And I would say, if we have not grappled with Hamilton, we have not really grappled with the origins of modern America. If you look at his understanding, for example, of the power of the press, that's why he helps found the New York Evening Post. If you look at his understanding of why there had to be a stronger central government, if you look at his understanding of why it's important to centralize banking for the United States, if you look at his understanding of why there has to be a stock market and trade, and what we talk about a lot here in Michigan, a diversified economy. You don't want the Jeffersonian vision of just an agrarian republic. You have to, of course there will be farmers, but you want to go beyond that. And there are reasons Hamilton thought this way, and we're going to go into those reasons. But Hamilton saw what this country would become if this country were to endure. He saw it better than anybody else. Now I want to take a look at 3 areas where Hamilton is indispensable to our understanding of modern America. And so if we consult his writing, he is an aid to us. First of all, I want to look at America's political order. Alexander Hamilton made and continues to make 2 great contributions to our American understanding of politics and political order. At the Constitutional Convention of 1787, he was the dominant mind on the Committee of Style. Now, I don't want that to be misleading. I'm not talking about somebody who's just talking about fancy words. I'm talking about somebody who's going to bring a fine mind with a great deal of substance to the Committee of Style. And he helped shape that preamble. Some of the most important 52 words in our nation's vocabulary. It's what you picked up on your way in, and we'll go over it here in a minute. He helped shape that preamble with its incisive argument. I will show you how the preamble is an argument for the idea of ordered liberty. Now, after the Constitution, he made his second great contribution to our political understanding. He wrote some 50 of the 85 Federalist Papers expounding on the meaning of the Constitution and arguing for its ratification. Now, where did Hamilton's ideas come from? Obviously, this was a man who was extremely well read. He read Adam Smith, he read Pufendorf, he read the leading European theorists of the day. But also, a lot of his ideas came from his experience, and specifically his experiences in military service. Now, what I'm about to say, this is not unusual. Since Ralph Hauenstein is here, Ralph Hauenstein served on Eisenhower's staff during World War II. He's the chief of intelligence there, during D-Day, for example. Eisenhower had acquired a great deal of knowledge about the military and how it operates, and also about civilian government in the process. But it was because of Eisenhower's transcontinental trip in a military convoy in 1919 that failed miserably because of the bad roads that years later comes back, 3 decades later, into the idea of the interstate highway system. So a lot of men who serve in the military come by their ideas through this experience. And the military requires people to push all of their thinking to the limits because it is a life and death endeavor. So Hamilton was no different. He rose to the rank of colonel in the Continental Army, and he watched as General Washington and his officers struggled to keep the Army clothed, fed, and armed sufficiently. See, it was a terrible situation because you had the 13 independent states. They had been independent colonies. And of course, under the Articles of Confederation, the Army was dependent on gifts for all of their clothing, their food, their armaments, from the 13 different colonies. And there was no way to have a uniform system of taxation to provide for the men. And so as helter-skelter, Massachusetts might be well-provisioned 1 month, North Carolina the next. You never knew. And morale could be low in the plantation of Rhode Island and high in Connecticut. You'd never know among the men in Connecticut. So it's important to understand Hamilton's understanding of the need for a strong central government arising out of that experience with the Continental Army. Not surprisingly, he's barely out, I mean, really not even out of the Army yet. He's already thinking, how do we revise the Articles of Confederation so that we get a stronger central government so we can fight a war and defend ourselves? This was the problem. If we remain 13 disparate colonies, a foreign power, and remember the superpowers of those days like Britain and France, if ever there were an alliance against us, if ever they came back over in force and the publics in those countries supported a war, the United States would remain vulnerable. We could not remain 13 separate colonies. So already in the Army, he's trying to figure out how to strengthen the Articles of Confederation. He gets out of the Army and he thinks, you know what, we need to call a constitutional convention. So he writes the bill calling for, the resolution calling for a constitutional convention. He writes it. He's the guy who's going to author, along with others, the desire to have this stronger government. Now think of this position that it puts him in. He's going to literally, in a sense, author the American Revolution. So he's going to be, in playwright or movie terms, he's going to be a producer, a director, and an actor in the whole script. It's remarkable for a 20-something. This guy had self-confidence. When Hamilton went to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787, it's about as hot as it is out here. It was a terribly hot summer. He met for 4 months. All the windows were closed so that the delegates could meet in secret. Hamilton went with 2 other New Yorkers, so the 3 of them were there. Hamilton didn't get along with the other New Yorkers at all. They were anti-federalists. They did not want to see all of this centralization. In fact, those guys go home sort of in a pout themselves, and the convention has a lot of dissension. Hamilton himself is so curious. For such a bright guy, his ideas really didn't get a lot of traction at the Constitutional Convention. He just was not selling his points. He wanted extremely strong executive, elected for a lifetime. He wanted senators elected for a lifetime. It was considered way too much for most of the delegates there, especially the anti-federalist influence, even within his own state delegation. So he was really kind of isolated. The one thing that he did do, though, was serve on this Committee of Style. And this is where I'd like to spend just a little bit of time with you. And to do this, I want to look at the preamble, and it's so appropriate. I don't know if this was by design or not, but if you take the $10 bill, the new $10 bill, you see in the right-hand side of the portrait side, "We the People." Now, it's appropriate that that would appear on the same side of a denomination as Hamilton's portrait, because Hamilton was the leading intellect, the leading mind on that Committee of Style that you are holding in your hands, hopefully. Does everybody have a copy of that? Does anybody need a copy?
Sure, I'll take that.
Somebody wants this copy. You don't get it yet, because I'm going to still use this. Very funny. I want to go through this just a little bit. We, the people of the United States, in order to... Now, notice what happens here. There are 6 infinitive phrases that follow, and these 6 infinitive phrases are going to talk about the purpose of government. And they're going to talk about the purpose of government in a very, I'm going to argue, in a very specific order. It's not just random words for rhetorical flourish. This is actually a rhetorical argument that is being advanced here in the preamble. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union. This is the first purpose of government. You need to be able to define a unit of land, and you know the boundaries, and you draw a circle around it, and you say, this is the land inside of which we shall govern. This people, will be uniform laws inside of here. Establish justice. That is the second point. So once you have the land, once you have the unit that you need to look at, it's important that there be a system of justice in which property rights will be respected, contracts honored, protection of life and limb, that kind of thing. So that's the second purpose of government, after you have the place where you are going to govern. Then to ensure domestic tranquility. Well, obviously, you need to have justice to ensure domestic tranquility, because if people don't believe there's justice, they will take the law into their own hands. So this is the third purpose of government that follows the union, the property, the system of justice. Provide for the common defense. Now this makes sense that once you have established the other areas that are discussed in the preamble, then you are capable of defending yourselves. Isn't the lesson of South Vietnam that if you don't have justice inside the country, if you don't have domestic tranquility, no amount of foreign aid can really save you. You will fall from within. This is the problem Kennedy faced with Diem in 1963, November, the coup in 63, the same month that Kennedy is assassinated. And Diem is overthrown. And there was a series of military coups in Vietnam, and Vietnam never recovers from that. So they cannot defend themselves from without because they have such corruption within. Promote the general welfare. Now, this is an important line here. This does not mean, don't think welfare checks or a safety net or something like that. By definition, everybody who came to the United States in the 1800s was poor. This was an immigrant population that came here. These were the dregs of society that came to these shores. The federal government never felt it necessary to have a welfare system, even though the population coming in constantly was poor. What the general welfare means in this context is once you have the justice, once you have the tranquility, once you have a defense, then you can begin systematically to help people do their commerce, make a living. And you do that through communication and transportation. You establish good roads, you establish a good postal service. That's promoting the general welfare in the 18th century context. Again, it's not a welfare system as we think of the word. That's why it's very misleading today when you read the words, but that's what the founders meant. It's promoting the general welfare by these public acts that will help people achieve their own goals. Now notice something. Only at the very end, the sixth infinitive phrase here, secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Notice that the word liberty does not show up in the preamble until almost the end. Notice that this is just the opposite of the Declaration of Independence, where the idea of liberty is at the beginning. This is for a reason. Hamilton is a political genius. He understands that liberty has to be ordered in a certain way. It has to be ordered by justice. It has to be ordered by defense, tranquility. It has to be ordered by morals and manners. Only when all of these other factors are in place can a country begin meaningfully to talk about liberty. So there's a reason liberty comes at the end of all this list. And notice that it's the object of a preposition. He's saying to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity. He even sort of downplays the liberty a little bit. Now, he was for freedom, don't get me wrong, but he's making an argument. Hamilton and the Committee of Style, and Gouverneur Morris is the one who actually, pins the preamble, but Hamilton's the brain behind it. He's making the argument that liberty is meaningless if it's not ordered first. If you don't have the seed bed of order and liberty working together. A very important and substantial argument. Again, these 52 words are rarely talked about in this way, but they obviously are the work of a genius who understood the political philosophy of ordered liberty. And ironically, a majority of Americans in 1787 did not really want to be governed by the document. And that's where Hamilton's second great contribution comes in politically, because he writes these op-ed pieces. Remember, the Federalist Papers are op-ed newspaper pieces. Just open up your paper today. How many of you have read any of the Federalist Papers? Say number 10, number 51, and you see that the language is very elevated. The historical allusions are very sophisticated, because Hamilton and Madison and Jay are talking about the ancient republics of Greece and Rome and the Venetian Republic and how these republics faded. It assumed a huge knowledge base among readers. And they were published originally in New York newspapers, but they became so popular, so persuasive, that newspapers up and down the eastern seaboard began publishing. These were the Federalist Papers, wanting ratification of the Constitution. Of course, the Anti-Federalists are fighting that process, which gave all the more rhetorical urgency to the papers themselves. They are a marvelous read, and that's why the Federalist Papers continue to be published in these great books formats even to this day. I want us to just take a step back. Think just a minute. Let's get away from Hamilton per se, but think of what this means, what I've just explained about the Constitution. You know, one of the persistent problems in human history for thousands of years was how to break the constitutional cycle that was always being ruptured by revolution. There were always, in ancient republics, the temptation to fall to a dictatorship. Our founders were aware of that. They wanted to break that cycle. Polybius was the ancient writer who spelled this out. He said, every people start out with a monarch. And the monarch's a good monarch, but a few generations go by and the sons, the grandsons, great-grandsons get corrupted and it becomes a tyranny. And then the aristocrats rise up. They don't like the institution of the monarchy anymore. The aristocrats rise up. And for a while, they're very good rulers as well. But the aristocrats, after a few generations, they degenerate as well. And they degenerate into an oligarchy that just tries to protect itself. And then once the oligarchy has been in power for a while, the people say, well, this is rotten, this isn't working. And so the people rise up and create a democracy. They overthrow the oligarchs, the former aristocrats. And then they rule for a while, but then the people become corrupted. And then the people essentially go into a mobocracy once they're corrupted and just self-seeking. And out of that chaos, see what I'm doing? I'm going to make a big revolutionary wheel here. Out of that chaos of the mobocracy, the people say, we've got to get over this chaos. We need to have a strong man, a monarch, a good king, and the good king rises again. That was the history again and again and again in the ancient world. That was the history that Hamilton, Madison, Washington, Adams, all aware of. It had been a persistent problem in the human condition. How do you break out of this fragile constitutional cycle and create a constitution that is meaningful, that is going to endure and give people true ordered freedom? Well, that, ladies and gentlemen, is what Hamilton was able to do along with a number of other people in Philadelphia when they crafted a document that provided for mixed forms of government, you know, with the aristocracy being, or the monarchy being expressed in a president, an aristocracy being expressed by senators who are elected for 6 years, Supreme Court members elected for life. The more democratic impulse comes out of the House of Representatives, elected every 2 years. They mix that government, and then they put it all together in a federated polity so that the states retained a lot of power. You know, we know from the 9th and 10th Amendments, for example. States retain a lot of power vis-a-vis federal government. What they created was a marvelous example of statecraft. Greatest constitution ever, obviously. But it's just important to take a step back and see what Hamilton and the others contributed. They solved a problem that had vexed humanity for 3,000 years at least, probably more. Answering the question, how shall we then live together? The basic question that underlies all politics. Okay, let's move to the second area where Hamilton made a great contribution and has aided both his own time and ours, and that's his contribution to economics. And if you hold up the $10 bill, I'm staying away from this side of the room. He's got his eye on it. If you hold up that $10 bill and hold it up to the light, and I noticed this just this last weekend when I was thinking about preparing for this talk, and you see if you hold it up to the light, you'll see that Alexander Hamilton's face is right there, and behind him is a big building. And you turn it over to find out what the building is, and it's the U.S. Treasury Department. And it's so appropriate, of course, that he is imposed over the Treasury Department of the building. And we've got people testing the theory. It's right? He's over the Treasury right there. Well, the Treasury Department was Hamilton's official position, but he was too assertive, too energetic, too patriotic to remain just a treasurer. He did all kinds of things that were very interesting. And we'll get to that momentarily. But where did his treasury ideas come from? Again, he read Adam Smith. Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, remember, it comes out in 1776. But also go back to his experiences as a boy in the Caribbean. And look at his upbringing on Nevis and St. Croix. Those two islands that have these cotton and sugarcane plantations, live on rum and the triangular trade, and live on slavery. And Hamilton thought that slavery would ruin a modern economic system. Besides being a moral outrage, found it absolutely unacceptable. This is why he was a leader in a manumission society in New York to try to free the slaves in his colony. But Hamilton was able to take the lessons from Nevis and St. Croix, where he said that the economies were too specialized there. If they needed any manufactured goods, they were utterly dependent on imports, and they could be held hostage very easily because of that. And he thought a more diversified economy would be a much healthier way to exist and to thrive. So that's where this idea of a very mixed economy comes from that Jefferson, for example, did not have. Also, his military experience taught him the same thing, that if you were in the military and you were trying to get provisions for your units, you were dependent on maybe the Dutch or the French because the colonists didn't manufacture enough. He thought, if we're going to protect ourselves in war as a nascent republic, as a new republic, we're going to have to manufacture more so that we can be more independent. So he thought it was important from that, the military experience as well. And this is, as I said earlier, this had a lot to do, military experience also in informing his political experience, well as the economic outlook as well. So by the time he's, publishing his reports on manufacturers and public credit, he's already thought through these things as a 30-something, as a 40-something, to a much greater degree than a lot of people around him. And of course, the list of credits. Just very briefly, he has this plan to assume domestic and foreign debt, pay off federal war bonds, create a national mechanism for collecting taxes, and so forth. He creates a modern financial foundation for the new republic to grow. Now, as you know, Madison and Jefferson were vehemently opposed to Hamilton's plan, but Hamilton won the argument. And he did it with Washington's blessing. Washington heard the arguments of Jefferson and Madison and others, and he decided, after listening to Hamilton, that Hamilton got it right. He saw the future better than Jefferson and Madison. Certainly, Hamilton's ideas, Hamilton himself may have retired from the Treasury, but his ideas did not. I mean, this is why we do credit him with the making of the modern economic system in this country. But for those of you who were here the first week this lecture series started, I talked about the little encounter between the Jeffersonian and the Hamiltonian in Washington, D.C., and they're walking down the mall, and the Jeffersonian gets very boastful, and he says, well, you see, my man Jefferson's better than your guy Hamilton, because look, we have this big, beautiful monument to Thomas Jefferson, the Jefferson Memorial here at the end of the mall. To which the Hamiltonian looks a little puzzled, and he says, well, we have a monument too. The Jeffersonian says, where? That little statue in front of Treasury, is that your monument? No, no. Our monument, the Hamiltonian monument, is called Manhattan. All right, I want to move now very briefly to the foreign policy, the third major area where Hamilton was both of great service to his country at the time he served in the Washington administration and also to us as a guide for us to think about foreign policy. It's really a curious thing. Hamilton was such a big personality, so energetic, so insightful and intelligent that he was able to do not only his job over at Treasury. There had been no Treasury Department, obviously, before. This is the first administration under the Constitution that this country was going to operate under. He's making up the rules as he goes, often with Washington's blessings, with Washington trusts him. So not only is Hamilton having to blaze the trail at Treasury, he got very active with international matters. And in fact, it's been said that Treasury under Hamilton was even more active internationally than the State Department was under Jefferson. He got to debate Jefferson in front of Washington over foreign policy, and of course this irritated Jefferson no end. I mean, Jefferson's the State Department guy. Why is Hamilton debating me about my area of expertise here? And I think it could be said that Hamilton's view of foreign affairs was shaped by several elements. First, he had a very realistic view of human nature. He has been called Machiavellian, in fact, because he did not just look at what people said foreign affairs should be. He said, this is what people really are like. Nations will act in their own self-interest, and the rulers of nations will will relentlessly pursue their self-interest. So let's not kid ourselves with idealism. He also was an astute student of history. If you look at the Federalist Papers and look at the references to ancient republics, for example, it's clear he understood why so many of these ancient republics had failed. He participated directly for more than a decade in one of the world's most significant, let's go ahead and call it politically, the most significant revolution in world history. And he fought in the revolution himself in a military capacity. And so that also shaped his view of foreign affairs. And finally, he observed, starting in 1789, the excesses of the French Revolution, which broke out the same year that the Washington administration began. Now, Hamilton was justified, I would argue, in moving into foreign affairs as Treasury Secretary. First of all, the new republic's small army and navy had to be paid for out of the Treasury. And there's a very interesting story here. Hamilton subscribed to what might be called the Powell Doctrine of overwhelming force in his day. He knew that if the United States were going to engage in any battles, we might as well have a huge, overwhelming force with which to confront the enemy. And he argued that, again, as a 40-something, again and again and again, even over military advisors who sometimes were much more retiring. Knox, for example, who was technically the Secretary of War, did not subscribe to the overwhelming force to the degree that Hamilton did. And this is what happened. One of Washington's first challenges in the 1790s was to subdue the Indians up here in the Northwest, the old Northwest. The Indians were saying everything north of the Ohio River is ours. You all have the eastern seaboard. These are lands that we understood from Britain are our lands. So Washington tries to negotiate with the Indians, Blue Jacket and Little Turtle and some of the famous chiefs in what is now Ohio. The negotiations failed, so Washington says, I'm going to send an army out. Hamilton said, you better send overwhelming force out. Knox says, we don't need overwhelming force. So he gets Josiah Harmer out there. Harmer is defeated in 2 skirmishes near what is present-day Fort Wayne, Indiana, and runs home with his tail between his legs. And in fact, later is court-martialed. Then in 1791, the governor of the Northwest Territories, Arthur St. Clair, after whom Lake St. Clair over in Detroit is named, Arthur St. Clair then goes after the Indians. And in 1791, he is also defeated by Little Turtle and Blue Jacket. And Tecumseh is going to play a role there, and then later Tippecanoe, the big battle. So then, finally, people are starting to say, this Hamilton fellow, even though he's over there at Treasury, he's really got a good idea. He says we need overwhelming force. We need something, the 18th century equivalent of the Powell Doctrine. We need to go out there and really get the job done. And then Washington said, okay, Knox, why don't you get out of the way? Let's do this a lot more professionally, and we'll send out Mad Anthony Wayne and give him enough troops. And of course, he goes to the Old Northwest, to the area outside of Toledo that's known as Fallen Timbers, and he finally defeats the Indians. And the Indians then sign the Treaty of Greenville, and then they cede the Northwest to America. Ladies and gentlemen, think of how important that battle, Fallen Timbers, was. If Washington had failed a 3rd time, how many times was it going to take? If Washington had failed to subdue the Indians in that area, how long would it have taken for us eventually to come west? We don't know what the course of American history would have been because we were also starting to get involved in the Great World War that was going on between the French and the British at that time. So we faced a real problem as a young republic, and Washington had to solve it, and Hamilton presciently had the solution to solving that problem. And when he was listened to, the United States succeeded in its aims. And Indian policy was a foreign policy aim, because Indian nations were discrete nations within the territorial boundaries of the United States, and outside it, as you know, as well. A second justification for Hamilton being involved in foreign affairs was that the new republic was being buried by the crushing debt that I mentioned earlier. It needed to seek credit abroad. A third thing is that revenues had to be raised by taxing international commerce, tariffs on the goods coming into this country. Fourth, a commercial treaty with Great Britain was desired by President Washington. Hamilton had been arguing for this, and the president sided with him. Five, the fifth reason, the Whiskey Rebellion. Now this is remarkable. The Whiskey Rebellion, these farmers in southwestern Pennsylvania who resent the excise tax that Hamilton had argued for, and in the Whiskey Rebellion, of course, these farmers say, we're not going to pay the tax. And Hamilton says, Powell Doctrine, like, you've got to go out there with overwhelming force. So Hamilton squeezes into his uniform and he leads the troops out there. And from August until November, when all of the rebels are dispersed, Hamilton stays in the field. This is a guy who is just supercharged all the time. He's going to lead. He actually leads the troops with Washington at the beginning of the operation, and then stays out in the field long after Washington goes back to the capital. So there you have another very interesting incident. Now, why is it that Hamilton's out there? Where's our Secretary of War? Well, Knox, it turns out, right at the beginning of the Whiskey Rebellion, goes to President Washington and he says, I know this is a crisis we're in right now, but I've got some land speculation going on in Maine, and I really need to go to Maine. And Washington looks at him and says, well, maybe it'd be better if he went, and then we'll put Hamilton in charge. So Knox goes off to Maine at the beginning of the crisis. Hamilton says, I'll fill in that spot. So Hamilton was acting Secretary of War. The Treasury Secretary. Can you imagine Jon Snow playing Don Rumsfeld? That'd be the equivalent. A sixth and final reason that Hamilton was justified in his desire to help shape U.S. foreign policy was that Washington wanted him to be. He asked Hamilton for an alternate opinion to Jefferson, especially when it came to the Proclamation of Neutrality of 1793. Hamilton thought that Jefferson had, now this is going to be offensive to our modern sensibilities, but this is the way people talked in the 18th century, quote, Jefferson had, quote, a womanish attachment to France and a womanish resentment against Great Britain. That's what Hamilton said about Jefferson, his rival. Now, as you know, the French Revolution coincides with the beginning of Washington's first administration. And by 1793, war had engulfed most of Europe. You have Great Britain and Prussia and Austria and Spain arrayed against this new French Republic. And in the cabinet, Jefferson was adamantly opposed to neutrality, and Hamilton was supporting it. Washington sided with Hamilton. And the Proclamation of Neutrality barred American ships from supplying war material to any side. Now, a great biographer of Alexander Hamilton is Forrest MacDonald, and he writes in this book about this. I'd like to read this passage to you. In the face of war in Europe, Hamilton saw neutrality as the great desideratum, but not because, having known war, he cherished peace. Rather, he understood that war, in the emotional and ideological climate of the United States in the 1790s, would divide the nation against itself and sap the strength of its infant national government. Every year of peace, conversely, would allow the country to grow stronger and its government to become more stable. As a matter of policy, he therefore regarded war as acceptable only if the alternative was national disgrace, the sacrifice of vital national interests, or if the American people could not be counted on to support a serious war. It'd be long-lasting. Now, you see these very sentiments surface again very powerfully 3 years later in Washington's farewell address, and Hamilton had a lead role in helping shape the ideas in that address. 1796, the outgoing president urges Americans to avoid alliances that are not in the nation's best interest. Rather, what the United States should do is to try to set a good Republican example and be friendly to all nations to the extent possible. Now, there are obvious lessons today. Without making a statement about the Iraq War, or it's just good advice for the new republic, and it's good advice for us. Well, let me try to wrap up. I hope this evening I've conveyed that Hamilton had a vision. He believed the United States could become the world's greatest nation ever. He foresaw us becoming a Republican empire. At home, Republican, abroad, first among the nations, with a commercial and military reach able to rival that of any other superpower. And of course, in his day, that meant against France and Britain. He thought our commercial and military reach should be proportionate to the nation's vital interests. As our vital interests grow, we become richer, stronger, and more tempted to succumb to one of the great temptations in history. The temptation has become imperial at home, not Republican at home, but imperial at home. Hamilton knew from his history lessons that no country had succeeded in remaining a republic and had survived and had not become an empire. So the republic then was destroyed. And he looked specifically to Rome. Rome came closest to being able to take over more and more of the Mediterranean, but at a certain point, even Rome succumbed to imperial designs at home. And you have Suetonius' 12 Caesars, for example, that brilliantly and in very vivid language outline what happens when a republic descends into an empire at home on its own soil. See, there's always this tension in a republic. To be a republic at home and to be imperial on the margins, to establish order on the margins so that you can extend your reach. And Hamilton was aware of that, and he hoped for us that we would remain a republic at home without any of the succumbing of any temptations to a dictatorship here at home. In fact, Hamilton said that we were a Hercules in the cradle. He saw how powerful we would become. And he said, "'Tis as great an error for a nation to overrate as to underrate itself." Again, I think these are words that have a lot of meaning for those of us today who are debating, what our policies should be. And how different the Hamiltonian vision is from the Jeffersonian vision. I want to use this $10 bill one last time in this talk as a way of wrapping up. If you observe carefully, you've got two flames. They're identical, it's just one's a different scale. These are flames from the Statue of Liberty, Lady Liberty holding the Torch of Liberty. You've got the little one here, which is more vivid. Got the little red flame there. And there's nothing else around it. And then you've got sort of this faded Liberty torch that's much larger, and it also, if you look at the bill closely, is emanating lots of light. Emanating lots of light. Well, this takes us right back to the ancient, in America, the old conundrum, the old divide between the Jeffersonians and the Hamiltonians. See, I would argue that the Hamiltonian foreign policy is much more pragmatic. It's sharp, it's clearly defined, it's pragmatic. It's like this little flame. The Jeffersonian vision is an empire for liberty. This explains Jefferson's enthusiasm for the French Revolution. It's to spread liberty everywhere. It's what Wilson did after World War I. It's what Bush says he's trying to do in the Iraq War and in the Middle East. Two competing notions of foreign policy symbolized in that torch. And that, to me, is a little bit humorous and ironic because I think a Jeffersonian got in on the design of the bill here, the Hamiltonian bill. But it's a reminder to us of the debate that we face as Americans. And maybe most of us inside ourselves are a little bit Hamiltonian and a little bit Jeffersonian. We want to be Jeffersonian, we want to be idealistic, but we also want to be practical. We don't want to spend all of our blood treasure and all national treasure imprudently. So let this Hamiltonian bill, the next time you take it out, think of all the contributions that Alexander Hamilton made to our modern life. Everything from the foreign policy, which I just talked about, and of course his understanding of we the people, the Constitution, the preamble, and our understanding of our political order, and of course the great economic order that he helped establish, the alternative order to Jefferson's agrarian republic, and the nation we in fact became. Thank you very much. Well, I apologize. I spoke, my prepared remarks, I told my staff earlier, 20 minutes, 25 minutes. And I see that I spoke way over that, and so you've been a very patient audience.
That's good you did.
Aren't you kind? We could have a brief, very brief though, question. I don't want to exercise your patience, so we can have brief questions and answers. Anybody have a question? Yes, sir.
Can you explain a little bit how Hamilton became Washington's indispensable aide during the Revolutionary War? And if he had not become attached to Washington, would we be talking about Hamilton today?
The question is, how did Hamilton actually attract the notice of Washington and become the aide? Well, Hamilton had this aggressive ability. He was assertive, he was self-confident, and as a 20-something, he also had valor. Washington appreciated valor, and he recognized it in his men. For example, Washington in the Battle of Manhattan, you may know this. I mean, we almost lost Washington at several points before he becomes president. All of you have heard of during the French and Indian War, during the Braddock campaign, how he has the 4 bullet holes, has the hat shot off his head, has several horses shot out from underneath him. Washington had valor. He had this Aristotelian trait of physical courage in spades. He was not afraid of physical pain or death. And that's why he was a leader. This is how he led men into battle. He recognized the same trait in Hamilton. Hamilton was just like him in that sense. And so they had this bond. And Hamilton in the Battle of New York was rallying people forward, and Washington was so frustrated because his men exhibited several instances of cowardice as they were retreating to what is today the spot of where Fort Washington is, if you know, up there on the Hudson River. If you've traveled to New York, you know some of these landmarks in Manhattan. Washington was so upset that when he sees his men retreating, he rides down on his horse, and he's swinging his saber, and he's saying, "Get back down here and fight these redcoats who are disembarking from their barges. They just crossed the East River." He's furious, and Washington's officer corps comes down on horse, and they grab him and they lead him away because the Brits are starting to load their rifles and they're going to shoot the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. History might have been a little different. And so Hamilton had the same quality of valor, and it really comes out, for example, in the Battle of Yorktown in 1781. Hamilton leads the charge against Redoubt number 10. If you go to Yorktown, Virginia, and you look at what happened, basically the French take one of the redoubts, and Hamilton and the Americans take another redoubt. They take redoubts 9 and 10 as they tighten the siege around Cornwallis, who's bottled in at Yorktown, the village of Yorktown and the Nelson House and all that, if you've been to Williamsburg. So Hamilton leads this night bayonet charge. He's right out in front, and he takes the redoubt against the British. And if you've seen these redoubts, they have all the limbs that have been sharpened, so the soldiers, if they trip, they would impale themselves, and you have to run down and then up the sides. It would be dangerous. I mean, I watch my kids do this, and they got all this energy, and it takes time to do that, and to try to discharge your muskets or rifles once, and then to do that charge would have been extremely dangerous. Hamilton never flinched. So they had this spiritual bond, this band of brothers kind of bond going on that Stephen Ambrose talks about. And the other way that Hamilton attracted Washington's attention was just sheer brilliance. I mean, Hamilton was not the guy sitting in the back of the room wondering whether to raise his hand. May I speak? Hamilton was intellectually sure of himself, and he was aggressive. And when Washington would ask a question, and Hamilton was taking in what others were saying, Hamilton usually would have 2 or 3 ways of answering a question. Reminds us of a story of Patton. I thought, I've sometimes thought that the more modern analogy would be Patton-esque. Now, Ralph Hallenstein would certainly know this much better than I, and I will defer to him if he has a good story. But the one story that I know about Patton's intellectual aggressiveness, in addition to his aggressiveness on the battlefield, was after the Battle of the Bulge begins, Eisenhower calls together his general staff, and he said, "What do we do?" And a lot of the general staff are shaking their heads, and they're not quite sure what to do in that first meeting. Patton had stayed up all night, and he came with 3 different plans to repulse the Germans and to send them back on the other side of the Rhine River. Now he was the only one who came having done his homework like that. And he said, by golly, I know what we're going to do, and this is what we do. Ralph, you may have an even better story about Patton, but that would be very much a Hamiltonian trait, that intellectual aggressiveness to attack a problem, to come prepared. Hamilton wrote these extensive, he wrote more than any human being should be allowed to write in a lifetime. He died, by the time he was 49 years old, he had composed more. I mean, here's a guy who's fighting wars, who's reading Adam Smith. Anybody try to read The Wealth of Nations? Bedside reading? And staying awake? That's Hamilton. And then he's penning everything that he does. He pens, he's crafting arguments that are 3, 4, 5 times longer than everybody else, more cogent, more persuasive ultimately. And Washington is looking at these memos, essentially the executive memos coming across his desk, decision memos. Like, General, we need to do this. And Washington's going, wow, he's thought it through. So Washington recognized, had the same quality that Gerald Ford had. He was never afraid to surround himself with people who were brilliant, smarter, just in terms of IQ, and perhaps had a niche intelligence that he could draw from. President Ford's famous for that. Never insecure. President Ford was never insecure around people who are very bright, because President Ford's bright too, but in a different way. Washington was the same way, and he recognized in Hamilton a great ally to help the new republic in all kinds of it, win its wars, win its revolution, and win the hearts of the people through a good presidency. Bob.
What do you think, if, say, Hamilton had survived the duel, wasn't wounded or anything, what do you think would have happened?
You know, that's an interesting question, because he was still young enough, born in 1755. I actually disagree with the exhibit on this point. The exhibit, and Rick Brookhiser, who's the author of the exhibit, curator, says that Hamilton was born in 1757. I think he was born in 1755. And a lot of authors do. I mean, I'm not alone in that. He was young enough, he's about 49 when he dies, certainly young enough to have a stellar career ahead of him. And we could speculate whether he would have become a president or not. He certainly had all of the executive mojo to be a great president. No question about it. We were robbed, our American posterity, by his early untimely death, because Jefferson and Adams and Aaron Burr and others lived many years longer, Madison, and they are able to reshape in the retelling of events how they would be perceived and the role that they played in the American Revolution, and therefore the meaning of the Revolution, shaped through their experience. We never got benefit of Hamilton in quiet repose. Let's face it, he's a guy who never would have retired. Never would have retired. He would have been active writing all of his life, but at a later point in his life, say if he had lived into the 1820s, as did Jefferson, he was younger than Jefferson. Jefferson was born in 1743, so he's 12 years younger. Jefferson dies in 1826, as you know, on the Jubilee of the signing of the Declaration. If Hamilton had been able to live that long, I think we would have continued to have had remarkable insights into what the meaning of this republic was, and he would have had a chance to take on the others. It wouldn't have been up to his poor widow, Betsy Schuyler, who had to carry on his legacy into the 1850s, defending her husband. Hamilton could have done it ably on his own, and the nation is poorer for the fact that we don't know what he would have said removed. So the legacy, it would have been great no matter what had he lived longer. And it's just too bad that he was kind of hot-headed and intemperate, and at 49 he should have known better than to go out on a field of honor. I mean, the nation needed him more than he needed to have, I think, his honor defended at that point. I mean, he never went out there intending to shoot Burr. He fired and he missed. Why did he have such poor judgment to think Burr wouldn't try to kill him? So, I don't know. Maybe. Yes.
Going back to American Empire, do we know what Hamilton's views were on the Louisiana Purchase, Or did the duel come too soon for Hamilton to express himself?
No, we do know. Hamilton was supportive of the Louisiana Purchase, and I should defer to my assistant director at the Hauenstein Center, Brian Flanagan, who's written a marvelous paper and is working on a book on the Louisiana Purchase. But Hamilton was always sensible to the danger, to commerce, of having New Orleans controlled by the Spanish or the French. And of course, it had gone back and forth. And Hamilton wanted us to have total control of the Mississippi. None of this, we're going to draw this little imaginary line down the middle of the Mississippi, and you stay on that side and be nice, and we'll be on this side and be nice. Hamilton wanted control of the Mississippi, and he also, I think, was looking west. And he had, remember, he wanted us to become a continental empire. A continental empire, but a commercial republic as well. So anything that would have helped our commerce was something that he supported. Brian, do you have something that you would add to that, or about Hamilton and the Louisiana Purchase? You're the expert.
Well, he wrote an essay on it anonymously. He spent about a paragraph actually supporting the Louisiana Purchase. And the rest of the essay was trying to prove that Jefferson in no way deserved the credit.
Okay, that's good. Yes?
The point behind my question is that while certainly there were enormous differences between Hamilton and Jefferson, I really think that when it comes to the concept of empire at this time, most of the leading Americans had a concept of empire which was really overlapping, and the differences between them are really not very large.
The question is, or the observation that this gentleman makes, is that most of the founding fathers did have a notion of empire, and that in a lot of ways their notions overlapped, and therefore there weren't a whole lot of differences in practicality if the empires were attainable. And there's probably a large grain of truth in that. Of course, the direction of the empire, I mean, for Jefferson it'd be an agrarian republic empire for liberty, and for Hamilton it'd be more of a commercial republic or commercial empire, where you would have a hierarchy. It wouldn't be an agrarian democracy, but it'd be much more hierarchical society, much more emphasis on order. Hamilton emphasizes order, as I tried to demonstrate in the preamble discussion. Jefferson emphasizes liberty, as it's seen in the Declaration of Independence. You do have competing visions of what the country should be. And that's why I say, ultimately, that's a good thing. I mean, we don't have to drive ourselves into a corner and say, oh, well, I'm 100% Hamiltonian, or I'm 100% Jeffersonian. Isn't the genius of American politics, perhaps, that there's been a tension between those two strains of thought throughout our history? And that's what's given rise to such great debate and fertile discourse, the kind of discourse that we've entered even tonight. So that's what perhaps we celebrate, the ways in which these empires, these visions of empire are similar, and the ways in they're different. And that's the great divide that has been so fruitful in our national life and culture. So I hope that, yeah, okay. Yes, please.
Appreciate you putting the definition to general welfare as it should be understood in this time. Could you speculate as to what Hamilton's view of our modern welfare system might be?
Oh boy. What would Hamilton say about the welfare state as it exists today? You have to remember Hamilton was a prudent thinker. He believed in the politics of prudence. The reason Marx comes along, the reason so many critics of industrial capitalism comes along, is precisely that there were terrible working conditions in the factories. No doubt about it. Marx's critique is valid not because it purports to have some scientific socialism out there, which is just a bunch of hogwash, because there's nothing scientific about it. The rule of the proletariat. Marx's, the most valid part of the Communist Manifesto is where he describes the terrible conditions in which people work. That is an historically accurate snapshot of what the factories looked like in 1848, most factories. Hamilton, while he would have advocated for industrialization also knew about Book 5 of The Wealth of Nations. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the book that no one reads. Book 5 of The Wealth of Nations talks about, Adam Smith now, doesn't just talk about laissez-faire economics. Adam Smith in Book 5 of The Wealth of Nations talks about how dehumanizing the modern factory system is. And of course he puts it in gender terms because it's men mostly on the factory line at that point. He says that to take a man who has been forced from his country home, who has done a variety of things, yes, has suffered, the vicissitudes of bad weather, plagues, and that kind of thing, but to require him to move and to do the same operation for 14 or 16 hours a day dehumanizes him. Takes away, as Adam Smith puts it in Book 5, his manly virtue. He's reduced to little more than an animal. Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations, and as I say, I don't know why people don't read this. Adam Smith says, government has an obligation where it can ameliorate the conditions to do so. That's interesting. And this is what generates all those white papers in Britain in the 19th century. All those white papers for Parliament as Britain is going through its Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution goes through several phases. And the transition period, it's not all nice as it is today. I mean, today the factory, we are producing great wealth, and the factories don't look at all like they did. If you take factories in Britain and the United States, these factories are wonderful places to work because they're 8-hour days and people are protected and there are benefits, and it looks very different from that snapshot that Marx took in 1848. Smith, it's in the third world where you have the conditions that Marx was describing. So I think Adam Smith or Alexander Hamilton, since he was a voracious reader of Smith, would look at Book 5 and say there's got to be some role. It probably would take a different form from Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, however. Is that... Okay, I think one more question.
I'm just curious. With globalization, I would think Alexander Hamilton would have a problem. I just read an article recently that we can't put a satellite up anymore without buying some of the pieces to it from other countries.
So the whole question of globalization, and what would Hamilton's view of globalization be? Well, that's an interesting question. I've been reading Thomas Friedman also in preparation for this lecture. The World is Flat, and also Lexus and the Olive Tree. And Friedman has a very interesting chapter. It's called The Golden Arches Theory of Conflict Avoidance. And Friedman makes the observation that no two countries that have a McDonald's go to war against each other. If you want world peace, all you have to do is order a Big Mac. It's that easy. Now, of course, that's probably different now because somebody tells me that in Beirut there is a McDonald's, and of course in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem there are McDonald's. So now that Friedman's argument, which was about, 2001, 2002, Friedman's argument now is a little quaint. But the point is that, remember when Hamilton argued for the proclamation of neutrality, he's arguing for peaceful concourse among nations based on commerce. That if you can unite people, for example, just the other day, I heard somebody give a report on how can we get along better with Muslims. And the whole report was about how do you resolve theological differences. And I'm thinking, you're never going to resolve the philosophical and theological differences. There are too many traditions and too many ingrained schools of thought in both traditions. You're not going to get the West. Samuel Huntington at Harvard got it right. It's a clash of civilizations. Let's accept it. Let's recognize there's going to be hostility, and it's going to be hard to bridge ideologically. Impossible, I would say. I'm going to be very Hamiltonian. That's too idealistic. It's not going to happen. So you defend yourself. But what if this woman never raised the possibility about what the role of commerce might be to bring Palestinians and Israelis together? When I worked in the Engler administration, it seemed like a different life now, that was so long ago. But one of the most interesting initiatives was when Governor Engler went over to the Middle East. He went to Israel, he went to Jordan, And our Commerce Department was assiduously working with counterparts in Jordan and Israel to take Michigan companies and invest over there. And you know what was universally said around the tables? You know, if we can prosper, we don't care if you're Palestinian or Palestinian, we don't care if you're Israeli, if we can provide better for our families, if we can come together and trade together, then we will live in more harmony. We've got to leave those other differences aside because Palestinians and Israelis have too many other tribal things going way back, David and Goliath days. You'll never get over that stuff. But if we can find a new focus, and it's commerce, as just one solution. I don't want to be simplistic or Pollyannish, understand, but as some way out of the present dilemma and get them working together. That would be a very Hamiltonian-esque kind of solution. Maybe the commerce will bring them together in ways that they hadn't anticipated. And that's what we can hope for. So, an Hamiltonian answer, and that's it. Well, thank you very much. You've been a great audience.
Everybody's been a part of this lecture series. We need to thank Gleaves, not only for tonight, but and his staff. Staff,
absolutely.
Center, please stand so we can at least applaud Aide. Come on.
Well, you should have the Spring Lake staff stand too.
But we appreciate so much what they've done, and as Gleaves has indicated, the staff of the Spring Lake Library, Lisa.
Absolutely, Lisa and.
Thank you so much for promoting this. Starting from the exhibit that Claire found online, that the exhibit was available, and the wheels began to turn and things began to happen. So I think we have a wonderful relationship. Started with the Howenstein Center, and we look forward to next summer. We'll keep you posted on what we come up with. Please feel free to stick around. We have one request. We do have information on the other, I'm getting the details, on Hank Meyer, the CEO of Meyer. We will be talking about West Michigan's connection to Alexander Hamilton. It is scheduled for Thursday, September 14th at noon. Some people have indicated I don't like to drive to Grand Rapids at night. It's at noon. Right now, scheduled for the Pew campus of the Grand Rapids campus of Grand Valley. If you're indicated, can you just give us a little hand, raise your hand, like you might maybe go? They're trying to get a feel for, are we going to have 10, are we going to have 20? On a Thursday? Thursday, September 14th. We're just trying to, the staff's trying to get a sense to make sure we have a big enough room. Okay? Got a sense of it? Okay. They're nodding thank you. They appreciate it. They've been asking me, what kind of a turnout you think we might have? And they said, can we just do a show of hands so we get a sense? So thank you. We will make sure then. Make sure if you are interested that you call the Howenstein Center. Don't call the library. This one's coordinated by them. Just sign up, get your name on the list so we be sure we have plenty of room for that. Thank you all very much. Enjoy the exhibit, and we hope to see you again for the next lecture series.
Thank you. You know, no mention was made, I think, in any of the lectures, maybe one reference a little bit, but then